welcome to the Participating in Research Now workshop. My name is Tao Fan and I'm a research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute. I'm also the convener of the Australasian STS Grad Network and the proud chair of this wonderful organising committee that has put together the online series. To begin this session, I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm joining you from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd also like to pay my respects and acknowledge the Indigenous traditional owners of all the places that you're listening from. So this is the second event in our 4-week-long online workshop series. If you missed last week's opening keynote address from Professor Edith Benton, don't despair. That session and all our sessions are recorded and available to watch on our YouTube channel. Tim Neale will be chairing the discussion here on Zoom, and I'll be moderating the YouTube live chat. We're keen to hear your answers to hear your questions. So you can either put the questions in the YouTube chat or post them to us on Twitter using the hashtag AusSTS2020. So without much further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Matthew Kearnes is a Professor of Environment and Society in the School of Humanities and Languages at the University of New South Wales. Kari Lancaster is a Senior Research Fellow and Scientia Fellow at the Centre for Social Research in Health at the University of New South Wales. Jenny Kennedy is a Postdoctoral Research Fellow in the School of Media and Communication at RMIT University. And Timothy Neale is a DECRA Senior Research Fellow and the Deputy Convener of the Deakin Science and Society Network at Deakin University. So I'll now hand over to our chair, Tim.
Thank you very much, Tao, and hello everybody watching this stream. It's very exciting to have you all along to this second AusSTS event in the pandemic world. So this session today, I'm just going to briefly introduce it. This session today is going to revolve around the theme of participation in research, and particularly participating in research now. What is it to be a participant in research? How do we as researchers participate when we go about our work? And what exactly are we participating in? So in short, this session seeks to explore the many meanings of participation in research and do so by thinking about how methods and practices of engagement between researchers and others have been altered in 2020 and in the recent past. All of these alterations triggering kind of new forms of thinking, new thinking around the forms of participation that have characterized research and how those might now be remade. So how this session is going to run is that we'll have some short reflections from the 4 panelists, Matt, Kari, Jenny, and myself, on the theme of participation in research, and then some discussion and Q&A between us. But those of you joining us on YouTube know that you can put some questions into the chat and Tao will feed them back to us and hopefully we'll be able to get to some. So if you have particular questions that come up from what we're talking about, then don't be afraid to post them and hopefully they'll get to us. So that's going to take up the next kind of 35 to 40 minutes. And then after that, so some of you who have registered as Zoom participant workshop participants, you know who you are. You'll meet to discuss more specific questions about research. So initially, we're going to have this kind of 45-minute block of discussion, and then there's another block for particular people who have registered. So to kick us off on our reflections, let me throw to our first panelist, Matthew Kearnes.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Tao. Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone who's listening on in YouTube land, and it's great to be here. I might just, I initially thought I wouldn't have a slide, then I thought, actually, let's have some pictures to sort of animate the discussion. So I'll just share my screen. And hopefully these are relatively familiar pictures for most people sort of watching this clip. And I guess the theme for today is about participation in research. And I guess I wanted to pivot kind of quite to a kind of allied theme, which is kind of what I've been thinking about, which is research on participation. And to some degree, participatory research on participation. So what might that mean? And I wanted to start in a funny kind of place, really, but I guess by citing Ezrahi, particularly from his work Imagine Democracies, which has been a kind of a source of inspiration for the work that I've been doing with my colleague, Jason Chilvers. So I just kind of read out a quote and then kind of sort of riff on that for a little bit, if that's okay. So Israeli has this really lovely sense that of democracy as being both imagined and in performed in imaginative ways. So he has this sense that, and I'm quoting here, that democracy's precarious existence depends on mutually reinforcing democratic ideas, political cultures, imaginaries, institutions, and practices. A democracy, like any other political regime, must be imagined and performed by multiple agencies in order to exist. Like a symphony, democracy has to be performed reasonably well in order for it to be realized as a political world. So I guess in lots of ways, we might be thinking about the degree to which democracy is being performed either well or badly in 2020 in different sorts of ways. But as part of the symphony, notions of participation and collective participatory practices and spaces, continually kind of emerge as momentary ruptures and openings that unsettle constitutional relations between citizens, science, and the state. And what appear on face value to be novel and emergent participatory experiments are part of a kind of cyclical and continual readjustment of democratic orderings. So what's often termed the participatory turn might more accurately be seen as another reconfiguring and remaking of these kind of relational elements that make up contemporary science and democracy. So what my colleague Jason and I have been kind of working with is a kind of conception of participation that wants to insist on it being always in the making, always emergent. So the argument that we've been trying to develop is the kind of institutional fixes that have commonly been deployed to proscribe and balance competing interests of authority and expertise in modern democracy have both become simultaneously frayed and as sites for democratic innovation. So in this sense, participation appears simultaneously as a procedural fix for the contemporary problematics of truth-making and truth-telling, whilst also remaining a kind of insurgent refrain, a site of everyday political mobilization. The insistence on participation, it kind of coexists with its institutionalization and proceduralization. So it's striking to note that participation is simultaneously called for by a whole range of actors, both inside and outside the state. It's called on to kind of resuscitate the mythos of trust, whilst at the same time fundamentally sort of disrupting the institutions that are invested with notions of trust. So as scholars working in human geography and STS, Jason and I have addressed these questions by kind of trying to refuse a kind of position that's often sort of implicit in thinking about participation of either being for or against participation, or being for or against more participation, which is another kind of way it's sort of often framed. But really kind of trying to open up a kind of an area of research exploring the kind of material and constitutional settings that frame the conditions for different forms of participatory expertise. So what we've been trying to sort of work on is a kind of an analysis of what we call a sort of residual realist understanding of participation, and then a kind of proposition about how a more kind of co-productionist and relational understanding of participation might be kind of cultivated and sustained. So in large part, what we do in much of our work is sort of review much of the literature on participation. And for those of you who are kind of familiar with this space, you'll recognize something like the middle part of this picture. This is Arnstein's famous ladder, this sort of tool that circulates in many contexts as a kind of guide for good participation. It's often sort of seen as a kind of institutional gift that institutions can kind of slowly elevate themselves up the different rungs of the ladder. So this is a body of work that's really consumed with questions of the limits of participation, the characteristics of good or successful participation. It's very methodologically essentialist in many ways. The concept here, or much of the literature here, suggests that good participation is a product of good methods, and that kind of sort of rather circular argument. And in response to kind of some of the implicit methodological revisionism in much of the work on participation, a kind of a critical body of of work, is also very prominent in this space, and sort of highlights the seemingly paradoxical potential of participation to exclude, disempower, and oppress. And this is perhaps characterized by the third image here, a very famous image that was originally developed as part of the 1968 student protest in Paris. I participate, you participate, he participates, we participate, you participate, and they profit. A kind of a mode of analysis that points to the ever-present kind of power, the ever-present sort of potential for reconstituting power through participation, and perhaps in more recent years through a kind of consensualist, post-political kind of populism. So what we try and do in our work is to suggest that across both of these bodies of work, there's a tendency to kind of import in or to reify democratic norms and modes of political theory largely unproblematically. So the democratic in both kind of frames is ready-made, external, and external to the situated and material performances of participation. So it's about bringing sort of kind of democratic concepts in. And both, it's interesting and surprising ways, both of these accounts deploy relatively linear cause and effect sort of understanding of the conception between participation and modes of power. So that's consumed with questions of extension, demarcation, and scaling up. So what we try to do in our work, and this is, sorry for having a really dense table on the slide, we try to kind of characterize what the sort of features of this, what we call a residual realist understanding of participation, in order to contrast it with what we're trying to develop, which is a more sort of co-productionist and relational understanding. So I just wanted to really quickly summarize the kind of elements of what we think a more sort of relational understanding of participation might consist of, and some pathways to what we call remaking participation. So what we try to identify in the work is four sort of kind of core dynamics, and to sort of separate them in specific ways as we put it in this table. So that the first is a kind of real attention to issues and objects, and particularly the kind of the emergence of issues and objects within participatory formations. So that body of work that's particularly evident in a range of STS kind of studies that articulates a kind of object-centered approach to attempts to attempts to kind of understand the double move of recognizing the contingent construction of both objects and publics in the performance of participation. Thanks, Tim. We're interested in what does it mean to attend to the technologies of expertise and participation, and the formatting participation and through standardized sort of technologies. What does it mean to think about participation in an ecological form, and to attend to the diversity and interrelations between different modes of participation? And lastly, we're interested in attending to the constitutional framings of participation to hold in tension that notion of the kind of emergent potential of participation and the kind of constitutional orderings that stabilize particular kind of formats of participation in particular temporal and spatial sort of contexts. Thanks, Tim, and thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Matt. And our next speaker is Kari.
Hi, everyone. Even in putting together this panel, I think we've been thinking a lot about what we're talking about when we talk about participation. So thanks very much, Matt, for outlining some of your work there. In thinking about participation, there's kind of two sides, and one is how we think about participating in research. So that's how we engage others in our research projects, and in dialogue, but also how we participate as researchers in the worlds in which we intervene. And I think lots of things have been thrown into sharp relief this year when faced with COVID-19, and are forcing us to think about both sides of that coin, and how this situation is challenging the status quo and how we would usually just kind of go with the flow and do those things. So this morning, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we're thinking about these things in our evidence-making interventions in health program of research, which is a program of work I lead at UNSW with Professor Tim Rhodes as well. A lot of our work is focused on contemporary case studies of policy and practice significance in the field of health. And historically, we've been focused on drug policy and addiction and hepatitis C in particular. But this year, our commitments to the way we work and the way we think about participatory practice and entanglements in our field of engagement have actually flung us into the world of COVID-19 in new ways. So in our program of research, where the kind of methods that we use are very praxiographic, so thinking with kind of STS approaches akin to the work of Anne-Marie Moll, which some of you might be familiar with. So we're really interested in how objects are performed in practice, and that's what we mean by a praxiographic orientation. We're qualitative researchers, we're qualitative social scientists, so we also use interview methods, but also ethnographic observations, particularly of science-making events. So we're interested in how evidence is made and how science is made and contested in different spaces. And we're very interested in the emergence and contingency of how evidence is made in practice. And as part of that, we're interested not only in human actors, but also non-human actors and how we bring both human and non-human actors into our research. So in many ways, we're interested in how science itself participates in the relational materiality of implementation and evidencing in the field of health. So how science participates in research as well and in evidence-making practice. So underpinning all of that is an orientation to thinking about research as an intervention, that we interfere in the worlds in which we research and in the worlds in which we participate as evidence makers entangled in those acts of evidence making. So it's very much research as political practice is the kind of thinking that underlines what we do. So that's all just a very quick background to what it is that we have been doing. But of course, 2020 has thrown lots of things up for grabs in the way that we all work. Not least because we are all very much stuck in our own little homes and in our own little places and not connecting and participating in the work of research in the same way, and certainly not in our fields of research. But in many ways, in thinking about this morning, the challenges of 2020 and COVID-19 actually just raise the same questions that we've been asking anyway in new ways. And force us to kind of focus on that rather than going with the flow and doing what we do on autopilot. So the challenges, I think, this year are just kind of the same challenges except on speed. So questions like, how do we participate and how do we do this kind of work entangled in science-making worlds in a rapidly shifting and uncertain world? And in the work that we've been doing with Marsha Rosengarten, Marsha always argues that it's always uncertain. It's no more uncertain now than it ever was, but it's just that we're willing to acknowledge that at the moment. So what is the field in which we are participating and observing? Up until this year, that might have seemed quite obvious that we were doing work in the world of hepatitis C elimination. But a commitment, as we've had in the last few years, to following our actors into different spaces, and by that I mean human and non-human actors, has meant following our actors from hepatitis C and into COVID-19. The epidemiologists, mathematical modelers, clinicians that we are working with very closely as infectious diseases specialists have now moved into the world of COVID-19, and we've moved with them. The models that we've been following have also moved in very big ways into COVID-19 and are no longer so much a kind of esoteric interest, but rather a part of a global conversation about flatten the curve. So the commitment to participate and the commitment to travel with our participants, human and non-human, shifts our object of study in quite a big way. This relates also to the question of where is the field? We'd been engaged as participants observing scientific conferences and events in particular, And obviously those worlds and practices have shifted quite rapidly this year and moved online. So we've shifted and had to think differently about what the material spaces of participation have been. Up until this year, we were interested in how conferences take place, the kind of everyday practices of those scientific events. So what does that mean now that we're doing this kind of thing online together? Another question is, what form does participation take in a COVID world? And also what kinds of modes of convening are made possible? And again, this is something that has disrupted the status quo and disrupted kind of ways of doing things, including the way we do AusSTS workshops. Rather than gathering together, we're now in this mode online. So what does that mean for participation and how we come together? And I think in our evidence-making intervention program of work, it's been a mode of working up until now that's been very much reliant on that really classic ethnographic idea of being there. So how do we continue to be there, but in a different there and a different way of being, I think, and how do we continue to engage others in dialogue and help and have them participate in our research as well, and how do we create spaces for doing that? One of the sort of catchphrases that we've started using a lot with the participants in our research in the evidence-making intervention program is this idea of entangled actors. And we have one clinician who has really adopted that term and signs his emails off now as your entangled actor. So thinking about participatory practices and thinking about research and thinking about the worlds we participate in and interfere in as entanglements, I think has been something that's had great affordances whilst being faced with many challenges this year in doing research and simply trying to live in a pandemic world. So just to kind of wrap up, because I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'm happy to take questions about any of this. I think in our evidence-making interventions program of work, we're interested in developing a critical social science and an implementation science in health that's a kind of diplomacy is how we think about it, which engages a diversity of different knowledge forms and actors, and is very much attuned to how human and non-human actors can engage, and how science itself participates in that relational materiality of implementing and evidencing, and how we can stay entangled in those practices and processes. Thanks very much, everyone. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you so much, Kari. Our third speaker is Jenny Kennedy.
Hi, thanks Tim for sharing, and also thanks to Tal for inviting me to come along and be part of this great conversation. So a little bit about me and how I relate to the topic for today. I'm a media and communications scholar and based at RMIT, where I'm a core member of DIRC, the Digital Ethnography Research Centre, and I'm also an associate investigator for the newly created Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society. And my work for the last while, I guess post-PhD, has been very much focused on a particular site, which we are all now very, very intimately familiar with, the home. So I have conducted a number of studies looking at the way in which I guess, the rhythms, the routines, the practices in which we engage with digital devices in the home. Looking at forms of appropriation and adoption, and also dispossession as they come into the home. The more recent work in that has been looking at smart home technologies and I guess these new non-human actors that are coming into our homes and that are participating in our home lives, Siris and Alexas and Google Homes, for example. And that work has culminated in 2 recent publications, the first of which is a book that came out last month called Digital Domesticity with my colleagues at University of Melbourne and RMIT. And the second, another book that's coming out next month with my colleague Yolandi Strengers at MIT, Monash, that's through MIT. And so those books are kind of looking at, basically look back. The first looks back at the last 20 years of the way in which we have engaged with technologies in the home, and the second looks towards the future of what we might expect with these technologies in the home. And both of those books have used various methods in which to engage with the participants, especially the Digital Domesticity book, which has used the HDI, has adapted the HDI method of cultural probes to develop these domestic probes in which we invite the participants to engage in their own forms of data collection. And we use these in provocative and experimental ways in order to get types of insights in the home that we might not get through the ethnographic means that methods that we're also adopting. So coming from research which is very much focused in the home, I'm still looking in that space, but I have shifted my focus to look at a specific population, and that is low-income households, and the ways in which technology use and particular digital exclusion is experienced by those in low-income households, so those with incomes of under 35,000 per annum. And I've got 3 projects either in the pipeline about this. One is currently underway, which is an industry collaboration with Telstra, which is looking at the impact of affordability for internet access. And this involved an interventionist approach where we provided 100 low-income households with laptops and broadband for 2 years in order to engage with them about what kinds of digital participation was enabled by removing the cost factor of internet access. Majority of the households that we provided these kits to would have had only perhaps one mobile or tablet device within the home, and also fall into typical of that group would not often have broadband or prepaid internet to the home, would be relying very much on pay-as-you-go and mobile services. So already paying a significantly higher amount per gigabyte of data than those of us who are on broadband connections. So I have an industry project that's underway that has just been begun. The other 2 involve, there's a linkage working with a number of colleagues that's coming out of QUT that's looking at the role of social infrastructures in people's digital participation and inclusion. So how do things like schools and community centres play a role in people's ability, and libraries play a role in people's ability to participate when perhaps their own personal resources are limited. And then in November, I'll be starting my DECRA, which is looking again at the experiences of low-income households, this time looking very specifically at single-parent households as being perhaps the largest group that are most pressured by the lack of affordability of internet access in Australia, and especially having the double bind of having young people in the home who are, we know the benefits of being online are significant for education, as well as for sociability and for future work. And we have all now in the present pandemic experienced, I'm sure, the limitations of our own internet access, whether it's negotiating devices or spaces with others in our household, or negotiating bandwidth in our households. And so the present situation is making me obviously consider these 3 projects that were all conceived of prior to the pandemic. It's making me have to readjust how I'm approaching them. The Telstra project, the Connected Students project, actually began the same week that Victoria and most of Australia went into lockdown. So that immediately shifted the process by which we were able, so I can see my cat's destroying my plant behind me, the non-human participants in this talk. So thinking about the way in which we would actually engage our participants shifted dramatically. All of my projects are ethnographic in their basis and involve a lot of participant engagement, participant observation. And now I can't do that. I can't be with my participants. I'm reliant on digital technologies. And so that brings me to, I guess the 2 key points that I want to make, which is we can make use of the tools we already have at our disposal for the most part to engage in research. I'm part of the Digital Ethnography Research Centre. But there are limitations when the site in which you're trying to research has its own limitations in terms of digital inclusion. For the Telstra project, I've provided those participants through the project an internet connection and a device that is suitable for us to conduct our video tours and our interviews via video call. But in the cohort of participants in the Linkage and the DECRA project, I'm now working with populations that may not have the capacity for me to conduct video calls or use other digital methods. So I guess my questions are like, digital ethnography is only useful for a digitally included participant group. But also thinking now about participation, what does it mean for asking participants, especially asking low-income participants in this present time, what does it cost them to participate in our research? Is it ethical for us to be asking them to participate in our research? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. So I am the last of the 4 speakers, and I'm going to set myself a timer so I don't go over. I have prepared a bunch of random thoughts. I was going to be responsive to what those who spoke before me spoke about, so we'll see how it goes. My name's Neale. For those of you who don't know me, I do research primarily focused on how Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Australia kind of understand and manage their environmental surrounds, and particularly flammable landscapes that they live in. So I've been engaged over the last several years in a variety of projects that look at how people try to manage fire risks, both kind of in the long distant future, but also in the immediate term. And so what this has involved is a lot of ethnographic research with people who are engaged in trying to manage flammable landscapes. So that might mean spending time with people who work as firefighters, people who work on doing prescribed burns of landscapes, people who work for the government, traditional owner groups. And this means potentially doing a lot of formal or semi-formal interviews, but also a lot of what anthropologists call kind of deep hanging out, as well as some surveys. So if this kind of focus on deep hanging out, is obviously complicated by this present arrangement. So given that context, I just wanted to kind of mention how, for me, historically, the work in STS, science and technology studies, on participation has been particularly important for thinking about these research projects. So that includes works that have been mentioned, like those by Jason Chilvers and Matthew Kearnes, Javier Lazon and Nucha Mares, Manuel Tironi, and Christopher Kelty, who recently wrote a book called The Participant, which gives a history of some of how, in Kelty's words, participation has over time been formatted, proceduralized, and scaled up. So part of Kelty's point, and as Matt was pointing to before, is if we look at participation, we can see how it has become encoded into a number of systems of governance, consumption, social interaction. So that social media, for example, could be seen very easily as a form of mass participation in a kind of mass form. But this literature also makes us think about how participation opens up and convenes potential new collectives, and Nuchamara's work in particular kind of makes us think about, that without participation, there's kind of no public. You have to kind of generate publics. They're constituted through participatory exercises. So why is this useful? Because this double sense helps us realize as researchers that we convene publics when we generate research, when we try and think about what interpret phenomena in the world. There's no way of doing that without somehow intervening. And I think, rightfully, there have been a lot of kind of critiques and concerns about how researchers intervene in social worlds. But I don't think it's possible to study a social world without in some way constituting it through your research. How do you frame it? Who constitutes that public? How can their views be uncovered, found, analyzed, understood? So there's necessarily formatting work when you go and do research. So that's something I kind of wanted to foreground. And as these STS kind of literature highlights, there's always a risk, but that risk can also be understood as a generator of surprise. If you could guarantee what your findings were going to be, or the outcomes of research would be before you did it, then it would not be research, right? It would be just the proving of existent facts. Second, if the boundaries between researchers and participants were not blurry or not plastic in some way, then it would not be participatory. So participatory research necessarily needs to have this potential for the change of the horizons of the research and the blurring of the boundaries between the researcher and researched. So all that in place, I kind of wanted to give two quick examples from my own work. So several years ago, I had an opportunity to start doing research on the management of what's sometimes called cultural burning or traditional burning or Indigenous burning here in southeastern Australia. And so I approached an Indigenous group that I already had some contacts with, and very much approached it informed by research from Indigenous studies about how to do this responsibly, that I couldn't go with some predetermined idea of what the study should be or what the study should find. And so I went to this particular group, and I've written this down so I tell the story in a good way. And I went with a certain kind of approach, and it turned out that many people within the group who I was conversing with shared, or in anthropological terms, participated in similar norms to me. That it was good to kind of get a shared sense of what I planned to do, what I planned to collect, and how it might be published or and co-authored. But what I discovered through this negotiation was that there were actually people within the group who I wanted to participate with, who thought that too much participation, too much collaboration might actually diminish my instrumental value to them. That is, while it was good to interact and be in dialogue, as one elder in particular pointed out to me, we needed to also consider that my position as an outside researcher, for all its potential problems, also had potential leverage. This was a surprise, right? This is the kind of surprise that participatory research generates. It's not something I could have anticipated, and it set the frame for mutual understanding of the potential for further surprises and how we might negotiate them as the research emerged. More recently, over the last year, I've been involved in leading a research project, which is kind of the focus of my DECRA research on, let me just check my time. Okay, I need to wrap this up. Which has been focused on spending time with fire managers. And what this research has emphasized to me is, like several of the speakers before me, there is a quality of being there that cannot be replaced in the pandemic circumstances. That human collectives that live and exist through, live and work, I should say, through platforms supported by platform capitalism, like Zoom, like Teams, like Outlook, those human collectives remain accessible. I can continue to participate with scientists who work on issues of fire, let's say, because those are human collectives that have a certain amount of access already, as Jenny was talking about, to platform capitalism. But human collectives that don't already exist, or that are difficult or impossible to convene without platform capitalism in a physically distant pandemic world, those human collectives, it's now very much an open question how we might participate with them, because participation now has to be so much more intensively formatted. And that's, I think, a zone for discussion and contemplation and reflection by all of us. So I'll leave it there and open it up to our panel. If there were things we wanted to talk about, we've had a question come in from those watching on YouTube that we could go to, particularly a question for Kari. We've got a couple minutes. Are you happy to go to that, Kari?
Yeah, I'm happy to, although I think that, Tim, that you actually answered some of that question. So the question is, in your work, aside from noticing new or different ways that we can indeed be there, how do you register or pay attention to the things we lose in the ways that we can't be there now? And I think what Tim has just said answers that question in lots of ways, that there is a lot that is lost in these kind of intensively formatted ways of being together through these kind of online modes at the moment, that is absolutely kind of lost in the kind of flow of being together and being entangled in spaces together and in the temporality of being together, particularly in the work that Tim Rhodes and I do. We're talking about kind of global viral elimination and disease elimination a lot of the time, which means engaging with global actors. And I have never been as aware of what it means to live in an Australian Eastern Standard Time zone as I am right now, because the rest of the world does not function in this time zone. So I understand the question, and I think the paying attention part is the key part of the question. But again, as I was saying before, I think that the COVID era just sort of accentuates questions that were already there, which is, how do we pay attention? How do we notice? How do we really attentively notice? And in Kane Race's words, kind of attentively, like foster a kind of responsive attentiveness or attentive responsiveness, I can't remember which way around it is, to what, not only what's there, but also what's being silenced. And I think that's a really important part of our research, even before being faced with what's here now. So finding ways of noticing that which is silenced or marginalized or put aside, that might sort of be put aside from what is said to matter, and kind of bring those other things that to say that there might be something else, I think is really important. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, to that point, I think I don't have good terms for talking about this, but the anthropologist Sherry Ortner talks about ethnography as using the self as the analytic of the other. And in a physically distant world, those transformations of the self are necessarily reconfigured. How I interact with people and how they interact with me, and how we are mutually constituting a research project is just different. The textures are different. But the point is, how can we notice them, and how can that noticing potentially become part of our research? Matt, you had a question, maybe our last question before we end the discussion.
Yeah, thanks. And it's just to build on this notion of attention in a way. And I guess this is a question for Jenny, but we may all have different entry points here. So one thing I've noticed is a kind of economy of attention that's being attended to in interesting sorts of ways, and that I think is being kind of. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but I think it's being talked in different sorts of ways. In the sense, well, people are at home, so we can ask a lot more of them in terms of their digital participation. But on the other hand, that kind of sense of digital overload and weariness and all that kind of affect that seems to emerge. And I wonder, Jenny, I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of that.
Absolutely. Sorry, I'm laughing because you're talking about the economy of attention as my daughter is trying to get into the room that I just propped closed to stop the cats from getting in. Absolutely. I mean, we're trying to looking for ways to pay attention to, in novel ways, to aspects of our research sites. But we're also dealing with participants who have the economy of their own attention is very much stretched, whether it's by work pressures, family pressures, or also the weariness of the uncertainty of where we are. And so it comes back, I guess, to the last point I was making, like how do we balance that with the requirements or the requests that we are making with our research? I might allow that to be my final point. Are you okay? No.
All right, I think that is perfect timing for us to draw a close to this workshop on participation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on YouTube, and those of you who are signed up to the next component, we will be logging on to that in just a second. But in the meantime, thank you, Matthew Kearnes, Kari Lancaster, Jenny Kennedy, other assorted actors who have been present. It's been an immense pleasure.